Hi everyone. Good to see a whole bunch of people. How many we got in the live stream today? We got 25. That's great. Today is going to be hopefully a short lecture. I know I've said that the last 2 weeks, though. Today I'm committed to it, and I'm sure this week in particular is important for it to be short to you because you're probably all very tired and exhausted from working through assignment one. Because I can definitely feel it. This weekend is kind of when people have really gotten stuck into it, are really feeling kind of the first like pressure from the course coming down. I mean, from all courses, I'm sure, because I'm sure most of your courses have assessments due this Friday or the following Monday, etc. So just a quick bit of forewarning to everyone here live and to those watching the recording. This lecture has very little to do immediately with your assignment 1 or assignment 2. And the quick explanation I'm going to give you is that in this course, what we do is we essentially teach you HTML and CSS, and then we come along and we teach you a little bit of JavaScript. And then from here, we learn about how JavaScript is used in the NodeJS world, which is like command line. And then we learn about how JavaScript can be used in the web browser. And then what happens is, separately to this, we kind of learn over here about accessibility, UI, and product. And what we do after this is that we kind of come down here and then we learn about React.js in week 7. And then eventually we learn about testing, and how these kinds of topics flow together is that they essentially flow kind of like this. Oops. Right, so they flow down in this direction, and then eventually when you get to the end of the course, they've all kind of come together like this. Now, I just wanted to give you that really quick visualization because what we're talking about today is really fundamental. It's kind of something that's really valuable to talk about in week 3 and not week 6. But assignment 1 and 2 do fundamentally focus on these core topics here. So that's just something to keep in mind. So if you're really busy, really stressed, you can probably come back to this in a few weeks, whether it's live or whether you're watching the recording. And also, if you look at the actual course breakdown, you'll see that how the Node.js lectures are structured is that we kind of teach you a little bit, and this is a demo, and then there's not actually a ton more to know on Node.js. So I just, full disclosure, just in case, I don't want you all, particularly those of you who are really stressed or busy, to kind of spend an hour on this and then be like, I had other things I could do. So let's get into it though. What we're learning about today is actually applying Node.js in practice. Now, Node.js, you should have, if you've gone and watched the lectures from week 2, where we touch on the JavaScript ecosystem and Node.js and NPM, which are prerequisites to this, because you just follow these things in order, you'll know that Node.js is a particular runtime environment. It's basically a command line interpreter for JavaScript. We've used Node.js in the JavaScript syntax lecture to help you get your head around the basics of JavaScript. And today we're going to continue to explore how to get you comfortable with JavaScript whilst also touching on some subtleties of Node.js itself. Right. So today I've got my 22 T1 Node.js demo here. I'm just going to reopen that because, wasn't working. Oh, give me a sec. So what we're going to be doing is essentially 2 really simple examples. I don't know why the files aren't there, but I'll sort that out in a sec. We're going to be doing 2 simple examples today that shouldn't take forever. The first do it together is we want to write a really simple Node.js script that reads in up to 20 dates in the format YYYYY from argv. For each of those dates, we want to calculate how many days since that date have passed. Then we want to create a list of key value pairs that store the date and the days since that date, and then we want to output all of that to JSON. So what this exercise is really about is getting familiar with the Node.js command line interface nature, getting familiar with manipulating dates a little bit more in JavaScript, working with some JavaScript objects, a little bit of JSON, and then outputting it to a file system. So I'm just going to go and copy and paste this into a new file. Just get this file sorted for you. You've got to save it in the right place. something went wrong before the lecture. I'm going to call that file 1. Let's call it exercise1.js. So I've got this new file here called exercise1.js. I'm just going to put that up as a comment. Remember, if you do have any questions throughout the lecture, please feel free just to post about it. I will come and bring that down there, and then you'll see if I run exercise1.js, it's complaining because I didn't save the file. But you can see there it's pretty straightforward. Now, just before we dig too deeply into this, I've got a few people commenting on YouTube. So Nil's talking about, I'm just skipping task 3 now. We'll get back to it after completing task 4. Task 3 is driving me absolutely nuts. Yeah, so for sure, task 3 is certainly quite challenging. I think it's very wise to move on to task 4. In particular, you know, one thing I think is very hard about some of this stuff in general is it nearly teases you how close you are. And you often, I guess, at least from my experience, you feel like you're just like 1 inch away from it. So you're always just like digging deeper and digging deeper. And sometimes the really hard thing to do is just to say stop and come back to it. Like, you know, I'm like this too. I'll get really stuck into problems and just want to keep going and going and going. So I think that sounds smart moving on to task 4. So here we've got our file. Now, how do we read in from argv? Well, if you're a typical software developer, you are probably going to Google it, right? You're probably going to go to Google and say NodeJS argv. And you're going to look up the first link, how to parse command line arguments in NodeJS. You're going to get this nice little article about it. And then you're going to read down and they talk about process.argv. And you think, oh, okay, that's quite interesting. So what this is tapping into here is that if I go back to my code here and I just write console.log process, right, and then I run that, you can see that process is actually a variable here that has a whole bunch of data associated with it. Tons of stuff. I got everything from like modules, there's all these file paths, function, like so much stuff here. You can see stuff about the V8 engine. Looks very low level, right? Looks very like the random number seed. There's a whole bunch of things going on here. This is also another good example of like understanding the difference between the Node.js runtime environment and the web browser runtime environment, because in the web browser, if you just tried to console log process, you're going to get an error. In fact, I can show you here just by running code directly in the console. If I just type in console log process, it's probably going to fail. It says can't find that. However, again, same thing. There is a window. There is a window object, whereas in Node.js, we have the opposite problem, where if I look up the global window object, it says it's not defined. So just remember, it's all JavaScript in 2 separate runtime environments that are like add-ons. So we've got like new different add-ons in Node.js. So you see here, I do this now, argv. I can see I've got 2 command line arguments. The first one is the node interpreter. It's actually showing you what node, like this is the program that's running, and the second one's the file that's running on my computer. So if I had a third command line, such as what the question want us to do, let's do some dates. Let's do 2022/0214 or something, the start of term. Okay, now I can see that I've got some extra command line arguments. So how am I going to deal with this? Well, I am going to simply try and extract them. So if I go back to my web page, you can actually see here that they've got this like little slice2 thing here. So it's like, all right, well, they're probably using that for a reason. So let's try and see what this returns us. Okay, so you can see what's happening is with the slice2 argument, that is like a common thing you're seeing in these web pages, because quite often when you're getting argv, the argv values from the CLI, you aren't actually interested in the first 2 arguments, which are the CLI command and then the actual name of the file you're running. So now we could go and add a whole bunch of other files, such as 2021/10/01, and then maybe 2021/06/01, 2021/02/14. I'm just thinking about like previous term dates. And we could go make a whole bunch of these. And in fact, just to make our lives a little bit simpler, let's maybe even make a little shell script like this. So I'll make a little shell script called run.sh, and in that I'm just going to put node exercise 1, and then I'm just going to go put a whole bunch of all these different dates here. So let's quickly write out a few different ones. Let's get say the different term dates. So that was like, these are just approximate, but these are like the 3 terms in 2021, and then we'll do the 3 terms in 2020, and then we'll do the 3 terms. Well, there wasn't 3 terms in 2018, but you get the point, right? You kind of take this back. So that's 1, 2, 3, that's 12. I don't know why this question I wrote down 20. That's probably unnecessary. And then this should give us what? 3 by 6, which is 18, 19. And then we'll do one more, which can be 2015/10/1, like that. So now I've got my 20 dates. And I'm going to go and put this in a shell script. So you can kind of see, like, the reason I'm demonstrating this as a shell script here is to kind of show you that, you know, this is just like another program, another language like Python or something. You can interact with it with shell. So I could run bash run.sh, and you can see that when I now run my code, it's funny that JavaScript just like ignored all of that. Or maybe it didn't save the file. It's actually printing out all those dates for me. So Tanit asks a good question, which is, can you do index with a process process.argv2 bracket? Yes, because it's pretty sure it's just a list. So process.argv is just a list. So you could actually extract out a particular value, for instance. Like this will give you that 2022 date, like that. So this is essentially just a list. So I could call this now const all dates equals my process.argv, like that. And then I could start looping. How do we loop in JavaScript? Well, you can do this a bunch of different ways, right? You can say for const date of all dates. That's one way you could do it. That's probably like the most standard way. That's the way I would do it most often. You could also do a for each loop if you want to, with like all dates dot for each date, and then like a function to deal with it, like that. You could also do all dates dot map date, like that, and then have another function to deal with it. These are all just 3 different ways of doing the exact same thing. You'll see that they all print out the same thing. I would say that typically you don't really use map as much for something like this, and like map is typically what you use if you're going to return something. So this would be kind of a strange scenario to use map for, particularly because you're not mapping one thing to another. I'd say for each or the for loop are relatively common, though I would tend to use for loops, but it doesn't really matter here, right? So now we've got our for loop to loop through them. Now the next question, and again I intentionally picked a question that is a little bit tricky to solve. For each date, calculate how many days since that date have passed. Okay, well, how do we figure out how many days since that date have passed? Well, we could obviously go and start parsing the string ourselves and doing all these calculations and stuff, like figuring out what today's date is and then turning this into a number of days and so forth. But that's usually not that preferable. We'd rather use a library. Now, if you've started work on your task 4 for assignment 1, then you've probably started playing around with the date library to some extent, right? So like I can just very quickly show you. It's like JavaScript parse date, right? Parse date string. Now you can see here that the very top result is the JavaScript built-in date object, which can parse some strings. Now, as you can see here, it kind of wants date string in a very particular format. You might have come across this in the assignment. So for instance, date.parse, if I just say take this function, and I try and say here, well, okay, Unix times 0 is date.parse date, and then I'll console log Unix times 0 like this. Right, so we'll print the date, then we'll print the Unix time. You'll see that, did it actually do it? Oh, it's much smarter than I thought. Great. So you can actually go and grab this, and then I'm just going to go check. So Unix timestamp, we'll see what this says on the internet. I think it looks about right. What do we got? Sunday, Feb 13th at 1 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, which is midnight Sydney time. This is actually something that's really important to keep in mind about JavaScript, is that, you know, a lot of web servers out there, a lot of servers in general, they'll run things in UTC time, basically time in London, in England, because that's what UTC or GMT plus 0 is. in this particular instance, because the server, my home computer, is based in Sydney, the actual time given is Monday the 14th of February, midnight, in Sydney, which is actually 1 p.m. on February the 13th in London, right? England, just that whole time zone. So you can see here that what it's saying is that this timestamp is actually this particular time in England. So date.parse in this case is actually working for us, but there are some instances, I don't use that function much, there are some instances where you won't be able to parse things effectively, or if you can, you might not be able to calculate things super easily too, right? Like let's try and do this with date. If we said like JavaScript date object days since or something like this, right? You'll probably find some useful examples. Like you can see here, that doesn't look too great. There's some kind of like the JavaScript date function is generally not considered very powerful. You know, and there's probably a smart answer to it, but like typically what you might do is you would say go and get the current date as a Unix timestamp, right? Because we've kind of got the previous date as a Unix timestamp, and then you would go and get the current date, because the current date, like if I console log right now, which you would do is new date dot to, what is it? To I can't remember the exact string. JavaScript date to Unix timestamp. I think it is a get time. I think it's get time. Let's try get time. Get time. Eventually you can turn these two things into numbers like that, and then you can subtract them, and if you subtract them you can get the difference, which tells you how many seconds it's been. And if we go back to our original task, the task was to ask how many days since. So if we really wanted to, we could probably do this really quickly and be like, well, you know, this is like the previous time, and then we say like const the now time is new date get time like this, and then we can say, you know, seconds difference equals now time minus previous time, and we can console log that, and this will give us the number of seconds that differ, which is like, oh yeah, that's kind of cool, I guess. And then we could, you know, say divide that by 60, divide that by 60, which gives us hours, and divide that by 24, which gives us days, except I'm pretty sure that the times might have been in milliseconds looking at this. I think they're in milliseconds, these Unix timestamps, which is like, you know, this just gets really confusing, right? Because if I go back to the Unix timestamp page, if we look at something like this is an actual count in seconds. But if you look at some of the numbers we had up here, they're much longer. So like this is like, this is right now's Unix timestamp, and if I go and grab this one here, you'll see that this one's actually much longer. It's another 3 digits, and that's because this one is in seconds and this one is in milliseconds. So then you think, oh god, that's so annoying. So now you got to go and divide the previous time by say 1,000 to convert it from milliseconds to seconds, and then this one by 1,000, and now you start to get something more reasonable. And now you can, you know, round down, so you know, math.floor, and it's like now you start to get the days, 14 days, 150 days, and so forth. And you know, it's not terrible. It works, but the reason we're learning about this in the context of NPM and Node is because NPM and Node, since it's a package manager, it allows us to use some more interesting libraries, such as date functions or moment.js, right? So moment.js is it's a very, not very clear, yeah, parse, validate, manipulate, and display dates and times in JavaScript, and then separately we have a date functions library, which is the most comprehensive yet simple and consistent tool set for manipulating JavaScript dates in a browser and Node.js. Now, if you're a Python user, right, you will be familiar with the Python datetime object, and it's like string format time and string parse time, which are very, very powerful. So now what we want to do is try and use the date functions code. So I'm going to go date functions parse date string. So let's try and do it with a different library now. So again, I'm just Googling it. Don't store this information on the top of my head. Well, let me add Node.js too. So the reason this stuff is actually how to convert date to string, parse date string with given format. So this one's about how to turn a date into a string. This one is the other way around, which is what we're kind of interested in. Oh, and you can see here they've got a few different approaches, and you can kind of get lost with this, right? It's kind of the complicated thing about what you can get stuck with when it comes to JavaScript, and particularly all these broad languages generally. So let's try one out now. Let's actually play around with it. I can see here that I've got this const parse date equals require parse date. So, you know, I'll go and put that up the top. It's like an include. Great. And then I can see here that it wants me to console log the parse date. Oh, and it's got a few different things here. This looks a little bit scary, but, you know, we can give it a try. Let's try this out. It says to console log. Might make this window a little bit bigger for you. Console log the string date. What's the string date? Well, it's actually just the date. I might just temporarily comment out what we did before, and I can see I've got all that. And maybe now what we do is we enter the format string, which I think will be, you know, hours, hours, months, months, days, days. Or at least we can try that out and see what that does. Maybe I've got that wrong. So now let's try and run this. Now when we run this, what's going to happen is we're going to get an error. It says cannot find module date function / parse. Now this is because your NodeJS stuff can use packages just like Python can with npm, and we have to install and manage those. So just to be clear again, Node.js, right? Node.js is an interpreter, just like Python 3. npm is a package manager, just like pip 3. So when we're just running things with Node, it's kind of just saying run this with the JavaScript interpreter. But when we actually want to turn it into a package that pulls in other modules and stuff, we need to, you know, turn it into an npm module. So what I'll do with that is I'll run npm init, which is going to ask me a whole bunch of questions that I can just click enter through because I don't care, and I can go and change them later. Okay, and what's it done? It's gone and created a file for us, which is package.json. Now what I'm going to do again is I'm going to run npm install date functions. Now what this will do is this will go to like the big open source npm library. We'll play around later in the course to show you how you can actually push your own stuff to this library. And now what it's doing is it is installing stuff for us, taking its sweet time. But this is how you can write something that pulls in lots of different modules and stuff. Because with npm, you've got access to pretty much all of the modules on npmjs.com, which is just a huge website where you can find anything like rating, right? Maybe you want to find a star rating. It's like, oh, okay, well, calculate the average score on rating. It's like a whole bunch of stuff here. For instance, if I was to search star rating, there's modules out there that'll help you generate the visuals and lots of stuff. We learn about this much more when we learn about React.js, but the point is there's this big open source maintained series of modules out there that do stuff for us. So now that I've installed it with npm install, if I go run my code, you'll see that it's actually running now. The error I'm getting is a little bit different here, and I'm just going to get rid of that locale thing because I don't know what it does yet. And you can see it's complaining. Basically here I've got my formats wrong, so it's like it's expecting that my date format string is in a slightly different pattern because I've got my like Y's like that. So let's just try its one. Normally I would go and look up the docs. Okay, well that worked somehow. But here, so you can see here that whilst you might be thinking, oh, date.parse did this fine, why do I need to do anything differently? The benefit of a more powerful library like the date functions library is that if the strings we were given, if the argvs were in a more interesting format, right? For instance, imagine if the argvs weren't year, month, day, but they were actually something like, you know, year, comma, ... Like we could actually parse these with the date parse library a little bit easier. It was just dumb luck that the standard crappy JavaScript date works. Now what's the difference here? The date object, the date class built into JavaScript is built into JavaScript. It works in Node, it works in the browser, all of that works fine. Whereas the date functions library is a JavaScript library written over here that was wrapped up into an npm module that you can download and install. So you can't do this in the web browser. You can't just go and kind of install that very easily. You can kind of do things to like generate web browser code with Node.js, but again, we'll get into that. We'll get into that at a later date. So you can see here, this is very good because now we've essentially loaded in those dates for us. And we just got to check if they've done it right. So yeah, this looks correct. Basically, you'll see that my first date, 14th of January? Did I do that wrong? Okay, so now we've got an obvious problem here, which is like, well, it looks like it's reading in the months very strangely, I think. So it's reading in the first month, for instance, as let me just pull up the run.js file we have. Code. Yeah, so you see this is really weird because it's pulling this in as 2022 correctly, then it's 01 instead of 02, and then this is 1313. Now, again, this makes sense because of the time zones, because this is what the time zone is in UTC time. But the next one's interesting. The next one, 10th of the 1st. Okay, that doesn't seem to be behaving very well. So I wonder what's happened there. And you can actually tell if you look at it, what's happening is that I haven't read the docs. We should go read the docs. And lowercase m is actually for minutes, not month. That's why you see all the minutes columns are actually being filled in with the correct information. So typically minutes and months are like the same thing, but uppercase or lowercase. So now when I run that, you'll see that we're actually getting values that we expect. Okay, great. So now we've read things in, I'll call this parse date equals that. So now we go and read the library documentation, date functions, days since, days between or something. Okay, getting duration between two dates and date functions. We go and read this a little bit again. Interval to duration. Ooh, okay, this looks somewhat curious. Looks like we can just kind of give it two dates. Perhaps we don't even need to pass it with date function. You know, we could pass it into that new date ourselves, but if I say, and where are we going to get this particular library from? This is where we should really just go and read the docs, right? Let's go and do that together. I think we've done enough Googling randomly to demonstrate a point. But I think it was like interval to duration. There you go. This is what we want. You can see that to use it, I can just include it like this. Interval to duration equals that. And then I can give it an interval. Apparently we see some use. We have a start and end date. So let's try and use it like that. So I'm going to go and include this now. So we'll say const interval to duration. And then here I will say interval equals that, and it wants a start and an end date. And then I'll just print out the interval. And let's give it a start date. Let's try and just give it the parse date. Let's see if it takes that in. And then let's give it, say, new date. So this is a little bit weird because we're kind of like mixing like the standard JavaScript date with these like newer stuff. But let's try this out, see what happens. Oh, well, there you go. It worked totally fine. So you can see that these libraries are a little bit more helpful in the sense that the difficulty of understanding the code here was much less. For instance, I can just say interval.days here, and now I don't need all of that stuff. So by using these JavaScript libraries, I definitely made my life a little bit easier. And again, you might not even need that. You could just go and take that straight down onto the next line like that. So now it's like, all right, well, there's all my information. Or, you know, whatever. Now, some interesting questions are, what's all this like date function / parse? Typically when you do stuff with Node.js, as we might see in some other examples, if you npm install date functions, you will require date functions. What's happening here is that you're just requiring like a subset of it. So we'll see ourselves doing something differently in the next example. But for now, it's like you don't actually have to install that. You can just install the date functions library. And if you're not sure, a lot of these docs will actually just tell you explicitly what to install anyway. So it doesn't really matter. Now, the next part's sorry. So what's the Trent says? But you need to add the days from the months and years, don't you? I do. Great. Thank you. I just completely glossed over that. So it's like, good point, Trent. So it's like the question talked about how many days since the date that had passed. And it's like, all right, well, if we want to include those years and months, which I completely glossed over, this becomes a problem that I'm not sure if we can solve with this. We might even go back to the original method. Again, the point of today was not that we had a specific answer, but we're just trying to explore together because I feel like that's where we learn. So you see, okay, I'm like, oh, difference in days. That sounds really interesting. So we go and have a look, and then what we realize is like, oh, Is this what we want? Difference in days? Maybe. It kind of looks like, where's that pulled from? Difference in days. So you'll see this on the internet sometimes. So what's happened is I've gone and tried to find a particular library to help me. And what I'm pretty sure I found here is I've actually found someone else's library that they've used on top of date functions. So if you actually imagine how the NPM world works, and this was touched on in the lecture, there's a date functions library in NPM, right? But that uses a whole bunch of other libraries. Well, this one doesn't. It's a really simple library. This is like a core library, like a really, really fundamental one. You can see it's downloaded 12 million times a week, but there's 10,000 libraries that rely on that. For instance, there's a NPM module called Git Release Notes. And Git Release Notes is an NPM module that's built on 4 libraries, which is debug, date functions, EJS, and yargs. So what's actually happened here is I've tried to go and find a library like this, and I've thought, oh, okay, that's what I want, difference in days function, but the problem is this is actually a separate library itself. So someone has gone and taken the date functions library and they built a library on top of it. And then people go and build library on top of that, right? And as Jimmy said, yeah, exactly. So Jimmy said is like, well, there's actually a difference in days functions in the date functions library itself. That doesn't surprise me because date functions is a really, really big and popular library. So let me just go and get the docs back up. I think I've lost them. Documentation. So let's have a look for that. Difference in milliseconds, difference in seconds, hours, difference in business days. See how powerful this stuff is? Like, this is why, like, don't ever get disillusioned by not finding what you want. Like, keep looking, because very rarely you trying to come up with your own solution will be worth it. Like, even just look at this one, difference in business days. Could you imagine if someone said to you, oh, can you tell me how many business days have passed since then? And you went to write your own entire library for it? It'd be an absolute nightmare. So we can go and do something like this. You see the pattern of this is a little bit different. It doesn't take in an object with a start and an end. It actually takes in 2 parameters. So it's a little bit interesting how it differs like that, but we can still use that the same. I'll write interval here and we'll do difference in business days, except again, instead of the object, it just takes in 2 arguments like that. And then we'll just print out the interval and see what it does. So we'll see what this one does, and we get the days. Now it's negative, obviously, so we could make it positive if we want to, or we could just reverse the arguments, which will give us something positive, and there you go. How easy was that? That was even easier. There's tons of stuff here. So I knew that function was in this library, but like I didn't know that the business days or calendar days one was, right? Like I just knew this one is here because I've used it before, but there's so much stuff to it. Difference in calendar weeks, difference in calendar months, difference in quarters, like how many quarters exist between things. And these are all libraries written by people, and we can go and look them up. So if I go to the date functions library, all of these libraries that you can use, they're actually public on the internet, often on GitHub. So I can actually go and look at the source code of these things. So if I wanted to, I could go into, I don't know, source, and then I'll see a bunch of things like difference in days, and I can actually go and see how this function is implemented. So this function that's downloaded 12 million times a week, I can actually see that, where's the function call here? Difference in days, I give it those 2 days. It does some kind of assert for me. It converts them both to dates just in case. So that's probably how it can handle these different types of things. I'm not too sure what the rest of this does. Then it uses the difference in calendar days one. Pretty simple library. And these are all bootstrapped off each other, right? So I hope that gives a bit of like a sense of how this whole NPM world works, where you're just using other libraries. So we've done the first 2 parts here, right? We've read in up to 20 dates. For each date, we've calculated how many days since, and then we want to create a list of key value pairs. So to create that list, I'm going to say, I'll create a const like pairs, which would just be an empty object or like an empty dictionary. And then I'll come down here and I will say that pairs, where my key is going to be the date, which is the raw string date, is equal to the interval like that. And now at the end, I will console log my pairs. This is fairly straightforward, kind of like Python 101 stuff. I get something like this. Now, another couple of questions that have come up. Mark says, does disambiguating between functions with the same name from different libraries become a problem? not as much as I've noticed. I think there's a general, like, there are probably libraries out there that define the same function name as like a really popular library. Like someone's probably made their own date library that has a function called difference in... Wait, why did I do business days? Oops, sorry. I was wondering why it was 10. I was like, that seems low. Oh no. But to be honest with you, like libraries that do silly things like have duplicate names of similar libraries probably just aren't very popular and therefore they don't get used. So it's not a problem I've noticed. Jimmy says it would be an interesting topic to talk about what you think the trade-offs are for including libraries, including security, dependency stuff as well. Look, that's a good question. This kind of comes up. People have these questions sometimes about like, oh, isn't it dangerous using other people's code? It's like, yes, in the sense that you're out of control sometimes, and there has been these kind of hilarious instances of these people going absolutely crazy and like breaking the one of the authors of the date functions library comes along and breaks everything because they're mad at the world, and that breaks like half of the internet. I think there was it like LPAD or something? It's like, or I don't know. You know, you can look up leftpad. I think there was this story. I can't tell it great. I know of it. I just haven't had to recount it to someone. But there was this really straightforward library called like leftpad or something that maybe it wasn't this one, but someone went and deleted it or something, and it just broke like thousands of projects because people weren't using leftpad, but really basic libraries were using leftpad, and that, you know, it kind of recurses on. But I mean, I think there's a subtle thing to keep in mind, which is that, you know, 99% of us are going to be working or are already working or may be working one day in industries or projects which have a really high tolerance for something going wrong very, very rarely, that can be really easily resolved, that may or may not have a security issue associated with it. So, you know, if you're for instance, you know, designing something for a rocket ship in JavaScript, don't know why you might want to be a bit more thoughtful with things. But also because a lot of this stuff is open sourced and it's all properly version controlled, if you control your versions well, you can get around this pretty well. Like, you'll actually notice this. I went and installed the date functions library, right? And you'll actually see that I specifically installed date functions version 2.28.0. Specifically that function. So if they go and update it, if I don't update my reference to it, then I'm okay, because that reference is kind of immutable in a sense. You can't really go and... The way the NPM library is set up is you can't go and override that. Like, again, I've written my own little NPM library stuff for fun, and once you push the version, that's it. Like, if there was a bug with it, you push another version kind of thing. It's like Git in that sense, without the kind of history rewriting. So that's a good question. Now, to tie this off, we saw that we did that. We had all these different objects here, and then the last part was output this as JSON to a file in the system. Well, how do we convert stuff to JSON? So it's actually, JavaScript has a built-in method called JSON.stringify, which is kind of a funny name. But JSON.stringify will just turn any JavaScript simple object into a string like that, and then we can simply look up NodeJS write to file. I know how to do this, but we're looking for a particular function. We could find one with a callback too, I guess, but yeah, let's do one with a callback. Yeah, callbacks are topical. There's a way you can do it with callbacks and a way you can do it synchronously. They're both totally fine. But you can see if I copy and paste this code, you see that they've got some content here that is then being written to this file. So I'm just going to go and remove content and replace content with JSON string. And I'm going to go move this file system include up the top. Now, there are actually some libraries that are baked into, I think, the basics of Node. So, for instance, if I run this... Well, actually, if I just comment this out for a second, and I run this, you will see that it actually works, even though I did an npm install fs. And that's because fs is one of a few really basic modules, like path is another one, that is just baked into Node.js outright. I don't even think you need an npm module, so it's it's not that it's like an npm module that's baked in. It's just that it's a, because you got to imagine that Node.js is what is deals with the require keyword. I can actually go and require my own files. So don't think require is npm. Require is a Node.js syntax, and there are a few libraries built into Node.js, and you can include your own libraries into that. npm is simply a way of managing pulling other code down from the cloud. So now I can go and write that to say, I'll just write that to this folder called output.json, like this, and then you can see that it says if there's an error, console log. Okay, we run that code. I ls, I see that there's an output file. We've just outputted our code to JSON. So this is a little example. We've done a little bit of CLI stuff. We've done a little bit of NPM, dealing with dates, manipulating objects, dealing with JSON, outputting it to a file. That's kind of the scope of this particular example. Mitchell's asked a question: when we ship a program that uses these dependencies, do we ship the whole library or just the ones we import? That's a good question. Most of the time, again, when you use something on Node with Node and NPM, you're actually like 99% of the time you're going to be importing a library like this. I believe that when you ship a program, what will typically happen is you will npm install it, which will install entire libraries to your system. And then you will typically, and again, this gets into later weeks, you'll typically build something or run something from that. So like Node.js is run directly. Because date functions is a big library, you're going to have to install the whole library. So what that'll mean is that installation is a little bit slower because you got a big library. Though because you're including a small part of this library, it's going to mean that runtime or build time should be a little bit quicker because you're not trying to you're not loading as much into memory, right? Like the Node engine isn't having to go and load an entire big library into it. And this stuff's pretty quick, comparatively, compared to some other things we'll touch on. So are there any questions about this? Because otherwise I'll move on to the second example, which is a little bit less fun, a little bit less maybe immediately helpful, and a little bit more fun, just to kind of show you some cool things we can do. And then we'll finish. I probably won't take a break tonight because I think we'll just spend another 20-25 minutes on this, and then we'll just finish a little bit after 7:15. But before I move on to the next example, is there any questions about this? Reese has made a comment. Dependencies in general don't use a whole lot, right? Yeah, to be honest, it's all... I don't know how to explain it in a generalized way, but I've very rarely seen instances where your concern is about dependencies. Most limitations are often dealt with on the web browser, because most developers and stuff just tend to have decent computers that can manage all these things very well and efficiently. So if you're spending time thinking about if you're looking at performance and stuff like that, you're often looking at, once all my code has compiled and is running on a web browser, how is that running? Less so than it's so slow to work with. And again, it's something we won't touch until week 6 or 7, but the whole point of learning all this Node.js stuff is that new web technology, new front-end technology is actually kind of written in Node.js and is compiled into web browser JS. So, and again, that's a very simplified statement, but I just don't want to, who cares? It's week 3. We'll talk about it when we talk about it, but that's the gist of why we're learning this stuff, because it's how modern stuff is written. Tanit says, I was always wondering, why do we need to do npm and init? I don't think you actually need to. And I'll show you this quickly. You can actually remove the package.json and remove the package lock.json. And you can remove the node modules folder, which is where all those dependencies are stored. It's actually it's usually where the biggest folder, right? You can see that's 33 megabytes of code. That's massive. So if I remove that, and if I just do npm install date functions, it'll actually make the the package.json for me, I believe. I don't know, we'll try it out. Mark says, is there an equivalent of require if running JavaScript in the browser from an HTML file? So there is a little bit, but it's nowhere near as powerful. And it's not really tied. It's nowhere near as powerful. There's some stub code we gave you in assignment 2 that you'll see you can do it a little bit, but generally browsers are very primitive. Node.js is substantially more powerful. That's why a lot of modern websites are written in Node and kind of compiled into web browser stuff, because I'm using the wrong word there for those of you that know. I'm just simplifying it, because Node's just a lot more powerful and can do some funny things. But you'll see that I just npm installed stuff and it didn't actually create a package.json there, which means that, oh, it's just gone and complained. Never mind. So yeah, you do actually need to do something, though I think you pointed out you can do npm-i install. I'm not sure if that inits it for you. There's usually like 5 different ways to do everything, so if you have your own special way, you don't actually need the install either. You can actually just do npm-i. So like I is a shorthand for install, so you don't need to say npm install. You can just say like npm-i date functions. So you see, that didn't work, but again, I could say npm init. Yep, npm install date functions, and there we go. So what I might do is I might continue to use this npm package, but I will do our second little example for fun, which is, oh, where'd it go? I think I have an older version of the slides here. That's not good. Let me just quickly find it. I must have hit export. Sometimes I hit export too early on the slides, and it doesn't like capture my changes. Let me just double check if. Yeah, okay. Well, I'll update those slides, but here's the raw slide deck that I worked from. So the second example that we were going to go through was saying, let's actually go and make a simple HTTP server with one GET route called scrape. Now, we're not gonna. I don't want to spend the time going through all of this, because sometimes I write examples to be bigger than they need to be in case we like smash through things, and then we can have some more fun. But I think most of you will get the point today. But let's go and make a simple HTTP server that simply has a scrape URL that just returns something for now. It returns a little bit of HTML or something. So we can start with that. Now, again, the benefit of Node.js and NPM is that we can do these things very, very quickly. You already saw that we went and made a simple script just here that outputted some JSON with like how many days it's been since. But now let's go and start a web server. So for instance, if I now go node web server, I'm going to come across, ignore the ads and stuff on YouTube. But if you do some Googling, it's a very simple, sometimes you got to Google these things and read a couple of blogs, because there's just so much stuff out there, right? Like, it's kind of ironic that, with Node, you're going to have this problem sometimes of it just being too much, like just way too much to like figure out what the right thing to do is. And there's 2 kind of main libraries that are used a lot to deal with web server stuff, like HTTP. One of those libraries is called the HTTP library, which is what helps you actually start a web server. That's like a more generalized library to just literally run a web server. That's kind of if you want to do something a bit more custom. The other option, which is what we use in the course to actually build the backends for your assignment, I'm just looking if I'm clicking around, seeing if there are some other people using examples. There's not. I would have thought I would have found some of these on Google a little bit quicker, but we use something which is it's a Node. It's called an Express server because the library itself is called Express. So Express is a web application framework library. It's very, very simple in the sense that its primary purpose is that it allows you to do things very, very straightforward. And here's like a little example Node.js application. So if I just let me go and make a file for you, I'll make another file called exercise2.js. So now I've got this exercise2 file, and in that file I have some really, really simple code. I have express is require express, so I'm probably going to need to install that. I have a port that's 3000. I have a get URL that is slash. I might make that slash scrape. And all it does when it gets called is it just returns hello world. And then here I've got this app.listen, which console logs something. I don't know what some of this means, but I do, but you know what I mean? Like, we'll figure that out. So now I'm going to run exercise 2. I get an error, cannot find module express. That's because I have not npm installed it. Great. So now I've npm installed that express library, and now when I run it, and you can actually see how big that library is, right? If I look inside my node modules folder, oh, I didn't install it. I was like, that was really quick. By the way, if you just write npm install, what it actually goes and does is it goes and installs all the libraries for you inside your package.json. So for instance, if I was to have a new repo and I was to delete my node modules folder, if I just write npm install, it comes through and it actually just goes and installs the date functions, that version, express that version. So npm install will kind of like catch me up, make sure I've installed everything that I want to. But now we can go and run that little web server, and you'll see that just waiting for npm to catch up. Yep, so now you'll see if I go node on exercise 2, it says example app listening on port 3000, and now when I come along here and I open up localhost 3000, it's complaining. It says I cannot get slash, which is what it's saying is there's no resource for me to access on that route. But if I go slash scrape, it says hello world. So I've actually got this little web server here that's serving something for me on that particular URL. And it's really, really simple. And let's actually try and pay attention to how this is like working. So app.get is a function call that takes in a particular route, and it takes in like a handler. And that handler is just a JavaScript function. So I could break it up like this, for instance. And I could say, well, handler is just a JavaScript function that takes in 2 parameters, request and response, and it does something. And similarly, app.listen is just a function that takes in a port and a handler function, where in this case, the handler is actually what to handle when it works. So this bottom one here is like, this top one here is like, all right, let me take you through it. Express is a big module from NPM. I'm now going to go and create a new app, a new web server from that Express library. And then I'm going to go and set a port to be 3000, just as we can. And now I'm going to create a handler, which specifies how to handle a request and response. I'm going to take that web server I created, which isn't running, it's just like an object that we're kind of building. I'm going to tell it that I want to add a get RESTful route called /scrape. And when /scrape is hit, when a user accesses that URL, I want you to call the handler function. And I'm going to create another second handler function where what I say is that my app is now going to listen, as in I want you to start running and listen to a particular port on the system. And once you start running, call the handler2 function. And that's how those things work. So when I start it up, it says running on that port, and now that URL works. So I could go and create, I'm just going to go and combine these functions back together for you. I could now go and create a second function called, Hayden, which just says like, hi Hayden. And then I could just restart my server. This is just a Node.js script that's running forever, right? Like a typical web server. And now I've got a second URL called /Hayden that says, hi Hayden. So that's kind of us making a really, really simple web server like that. Now, just a slightly tangential question that James has asked, just so I can tackle it. Why is that not working? Select. I don't know. It's not coming up. Something's wrong. Oh, it's really funny. It's actually really interesting what's just happened. So my YouTube comment tool that I have, it's actually it's this little app called Twidget, and it actually lets me select a comment and show it. And how this tool actually works is it actually runs a web server in the background, and that web server actually runs on localhost 3000. So what's happened is my Node.js script has actually stopped this working. It's not appearing anymore because I'm running this server here, and if I stop that server, I'm not sure if it'll just magically stop. There you go. Now it's working again. So those two things were conflicting there. So what I might do, for instance, is I might go and I was like, why is that not working? Change this to port 3001, and now it's, just running on a different port. So James says, are open source NPM libraries often used to save passwords and private data? Could this make it more vulnerable than privately sourced code, or is it better for community to help verify? There is a great course, 6447 at CSE, where they do a lot of like security. It's called Security Engineering Workshop. Last I checked. If you're not going to do it, I'd at least do it till census and drop it just to check it out. Though, what I would say is that in that course, you learn a few things about open source code is ironically safer, to your point, because it's better that the community can help verify it. Security through hiding stuff is valuable, but if you're seeing a module like date functions that's seen by 12 downloaded by 12 million people a week, which would be used at most major companies, the amount of eyes on it are really, really helpful. It's actually ironically probably better. And when you say, are NPM libraries often used to save passwords and private data? I mean, I know you don't think that they're saved in the library, but the modules are, yes, used to help verify things, right? For instance, there's a library out there called Passport. Passport is a really common... how common is it? This is a library that's used to manage authentication by 1.5 million downloads a week, and it's essentially a kind of a generalized approach to handle login strategies. So you can hopefully get people to log in locally through OAuth, through Facebook. It's like a way that you don't have to write your own login system, and it's very easy to be like, oh well, I'm not sure, it's like another library dealing with our security, but obviously it's very well vetted. It's used very commonly, and also there's a lot of people smarter than me out there. So they're going to probably get this done better than anything I could write. And to your next question, James, can we use Express, the server we were playing with for our assignment 3 later in the course? I don't think that's necessary, because assignment 3, we're not getting you to write any web servers. In fact, in this course, I very intentionally left writing web servers out of the course because I didn't think it was necessary for the learning outcomes. The point of showing you this is just kind of for fun, to show you a bit of stuff like NodeJS can do, so that you can get a feel for what it is. But the other thing is that your assignment... I've just released it today. I've just released it before this lecture, so it should be rolling out to you, very soon or quickly. I really should not enter a TOTP password with that on the screen. Yeah, so. I've actually released assignment 2 an hour ago, and I mentioned I'd do this, but so I wrote the entire backend for this one over the weekend for this particular assignment, because we took a previous assignment and we modified a bunch of stuff, and the previous assignment's backend used to be in Python, but I actually went and rewrote it in JavaScript, and you can actually go and see that if you want, right? And you can actually see it's based on an Express server, and it's got things that you would recognize from here. It's a lot more complicated, obviously, than this really simple example, but to run this server in assignment 2, which we'll go through that next week, it's actually just a matter of npm installing and running it. It's all actually very straightforward in a lot of ways. Mitchell's asked a question: if you pass the name of a function into another function, does it always call the function? No, you actually have to call it explicitly. So handler 2 in this case, inside the listen function, there would be if I was to implement the listen function, right? I might have a function called listen, which takes in a port and a handler, and that would say, start web server on port, and there'd be an onFinish function, like a callback, and that callback would be to call handler. That's kind of how this stuff is roughly structured. This kind of approach is common to all type of JavaScript, not just the node stuff. Yeah. So now we could go and do a whole bunch of things with this web server. For instance, like in the original, and again, I'm not going to do this because we'll wrap up in the next 10 minutes. But in the original spec here, I kind of said takes in a URL and a parameter, a particular HTML tag. So what we'll do is I'm not actually going to have it take in a URL. I will actually give it a URL. For instance, let's do like unsw.edu.au, and what I'll do is I'll try and fetch from that URL, right? I don't know. Actually, I don't think I want to do that because that kind of starts to get into like asynchronous topics that are meant to be in week 4 and stuff, so it probably just gets a little bit complicated for people. But the point is that you can do a whole bunch of stuff here. Like for instance, oh hell, I'll just open the file, or something like that. Let's open my, there you go. Let's open the file that I made in the previous, because these are new exercises. NodeJS open file. So we'll do that. How do I read files in NodeJS? They'll give you the synchronous and the non-synchronous one probably. Okay. I want the non-synchronous one. I want the synchronous one. We'll get into synchronicity and stuff in week 5. But here, like this is the simple example for now. I want to open a file, so I'm going to import file system. Generally, I like to keep my imports up above because these are imports up here and the rest of this stuff is like using those imports. And then I'm going to go and steal this line of code and I'm going to go put it inside my scrape route. And I'm going to have that open up my output.json file. So I'm going to have this read output.json. And then you know what, I'm just going to console log data. You don't need to return anything yet because I'm just trying to like, get familiar with it. So I'll run that. Okay, I didn't need to npm install anything because fs is a library built into Node. And now when I go to my /scrape, I'll have to go to a different port. I can see that I'm printing stuff out there. Okay, so I have loaded the file. I now can json.parse it, which is the opposite of json.stringify, called data, and then I can print that out, and this will give me a more friendly version of it. Okay, and now if I want, I can maybe try and go and output some HTML. You normally wouldn't be like writing a web server to like quite literally output HTML, but let's have some fun with it. I'm gonna call it my return string, which I'll just make empty. And then this unpacked thing here is just a dictionary or an object with a series of keys. So how do I loop through all those keys? Well, I'll just quickly update this. I'll say dates and then I'll put a BR here, for instance. Actually, Express might even, let's see if Express even lets me do that. I've never tried to output HTML like this. Okay, it looks like it did. There's my HTML, BR. Okay, so it did do that. That's good. So now what I'm going to do is I've got my return string and I'm going to go and loop. Well, normally I would say loop through everything, but it's not a list. This isn't a list we're dealing with. This is a dictionary. So to loop through a dictionary, you can do it a bunch of different ways, but one way you can do it is if I try and console log unpacked, like I did here, I'm going to get that whole list. But if I console log object.keys, object is like a global object, I don't know, global something, and keys is like a static method on it, you'll see that this will actually take a dictionary or object and turn it into an array or list of just the keys. So if I refresh this, I get an array or list of just all the keys here. Now, there's literally a bunch of different ways you can do this, but like one way to do this is instead of, because you can't loop through an object because it's an object, you could say, well, I'm actually going to loop through my the keys of my object, right? So I'm going to loop through all the keys there, and then I'm just going to say console log my date key, and I'm going to console log what's at my date key. Now, yep, more modern JavaScript has some slightly nicer ways of doing this, so I'm just trying to paint a point. So you can see I have something like that. So now what I might do is I might go and append to my return string, say another string which might be, say, my date key, and then my unpacked date key. And then I need to put a BR here for like a new line, because if I don't have this BR, then it's just going to come out on the web page like just all jarbled like that, because it's still HTML, right? Like what comes back to the browser is just text that it then interprets. So this is like it's kind of funny because my Node.js response did not include any new lines, so the source code is really hard to read, but the page is okay because the BRs are there. So if I wanted to make this easier to read, I think I'd need to actually put in the new lines, because the new lines will change what's in the source code. So now you can see I have that. Now, do you need to worry about that? Probably not. But still kind of fun nonetheless. There's my web page, then you could, go and, oops, I don't know why I did that. You can go and have some more fun, like, let's make the date key bold, for instance. Let's put this in a code tag. I don't know why I call this fun. It's just something you can do. And yeah, and now the page looks like that. Like these are all very fundamental concepts. And most things you deal with are just built on this. It's kind of the cool thing about it. It's just a lot built on a lot of other stuff. Now, that's probably as far as I want to take this example today, because again, I think I want to spend less time in the lecture today because of the extra time we've spent in previous weeks. So I'll answer any last questions people have or comments. Reese says larger corporations have many automated security vulnerability checks, talking up to 3 to 4 layers of checks and whatnot, which will catch any high or security vulnerabilities and all dependencies anyway. Yeah. So to the question about vulnerability, when you use these big open source libraries, pretty much what it means is that you're often going to be much, much, much safer and more reliable until every 3 or 4 years something really, really bad happens and everyone panics all of a sudden to fix it. And this happened with the log4 stuff, right? And I don't want to talk to it because I know very little about it. I have better things to do. It sounds very dramatic. I had other things that were more important for me to do than spend hours reading about this, even though I was really interested in it. But this was an example in CF35s in flight. No, go away. Log4 was a really fundamental library in the Java ecosystem that there was a bug found in. And everyone was panicking because everyone was like, oh my god, we're using log4. And if they weren't, they were using something that was using log4. But, this just happens intermittently. But, you got to weigh up. It's like, is that going to be less damaging from a risk perspective than writing all your own stuff and then somehow auditing all your own stuff, which is probably going to be worse, but the only benefit is that it's not public, but also, there's a lot to it, but hopefully that paints the landscape. So James also has James has said something really interesting here. It would be safer to host your own downloaded versions of the libraries, right? So the answer is kind of yes. It's a lot of things, not just safe, but that's how it works. This server here does not need the internet. I'm not when I'm installing these modules, I'm not connecting to the cloud. I could disconnect the internet and they would still work because they're all stored in the node modules folder. Look how much stuff is in here. This is it's a cockroach. This is you can see I have the Express server, but the Express server is going to rely on things like HTTP errors and other things and other things and other things. So how big is this module now? Well, I can figure that out. So the module after Express server is 35 meg. And you can go and install a bunch of other things that can make it even bigger and bigger and bigger, right? Yeah, it's actually hosted locally all the time. And typically what happens is that, when you deploy code, say Eccles, can't remember how Eccles works, but how Eccles actually works is that the code is, I can look it up. We can go and look up how Eccles works. I really should put a better README there. But Eccles essentially just... So what it does is it actually... Yeah, it actually npms install stuff on GitHub servers, and then it goes and essentially copies it to CSE servers. But But Eccles is a bit interesting because it's a... I've confused myself here. I don't know how the backend runs on Eccles. Oh, the backend's separate. I think actually no, it's interesting. Huh. I actually think that could be something that shouldn't work that does. But the point is that, like, you know, npm installing, it's like I've got these modules, but you'll also notice that most if I ls-a, oh, it doesn't show you, but most of the time if you create a git repo, right, and you have a .git folder, if I git status stuff, you'll see that the node modules here is included, but most of the time you'll have a git ignore that actually ignores the node modules, because the whole point of npm, just like pip and many of you have dealt with Python, is that you don't want to be pushing all the node modules up to Git all the time. Like you'll see the way Eccles backend runs, it doesn't have the node modules folder stored in Git. It just has a package.json that shows you the different modules that are being used. And you know, when this is actually like deployed or run or stuff, that's when it will go and download them and install them locally to whatever server's being done there. So it all runs locally. You do need the internet to do the initial install though. Okay. We're starting to drop numbers, probably because I said we'd finish and we've been dragging that on. So let's wrap up. I think I asked if there was any other questions. That was kind of the end of it. So thank you all for coming along. I hope for those who have watched this that it was an interesting insight. We will talk about assignment 2 next Monday. It has been released. Good luck with assignment 1. We have a lot of help sessions this week. We'll have help on the forum. All of that. So very much keen to do what we can to help. If you need anything, please email me or post on the forum. I'm always happy to help. And otherwise, good luck. Don't beat yourself up. Most of you aren't going to do it perfectly. And see you next week. So have a good evening.